Welcome back to your ultimate pit stop, Piston Pundit. For decades, oil hasn't just shaped geopolitics, it's dictated the cars we drive, the fuel we burn, and the supply chains that keep the global auto industry alive. But in 2025 and early 2026, US energy pressure collided with a fast-adapting market. Instead of isolating rivals, oil routes shifted, trade patterns realigned, and North America's role quietly changed. From Venezuelan crude cutoffs to Canada emerging as a key Asian supplier, these moves are already rippling through refineries, factories, and vehicle supply chains. Here are the developments and outcomes reshaping the automotive world. Energy as a weapon. Oil turns into political leverage. Donald Trump's return to power revived a familiar playbook. Apply maximum pressure, force compliance, and reassert US dominance over strategic supply chains. In energy terms, that meant oil, the lifeblood of internal combustion vehicles, global logistics, and industrial manufacturing. The strategy was simple: disrupt rival access to cheap crude, steer supply toward US-friendly channels, stabilize domestic fuel prices, and restore geopolitical leverage. Canada and Venezuela quickly became central targets. Canada, the largest foreign supplier to the US, had long funneled most of its crude south. Venezuela, holding the world's largest proven reserves, continued exporting discounted heavy crude to China through sanctions workarounds. From Washington's view, choking off Venezuelan flows could pressure Caracas and weaken Beijing's refining base. But oil markets don't obey policy timelines. They follow chemistry, infrastructure, and logistics. As pressure mounted, control slipped, and instead of isolation, supply simply rerouted. And that redirection hit hardest where oil chemistry matters most: inside China's refineries. Venezuelan oil shock. China's refineries hit a wall. Venezuelan crude isn't interchangeable with most global oil. It's heavy, sulfur-rich, and tailored for complex refineries that produce diesel, fuel oil, and petrochemical feedstocks. Over the past decade, Chinese refiners invested billions configuring plants specifically around this blend. When US actions sharply reduced Venezuelan exports in late 2025, the shock was immediate. Chinese refiners weren't just losing volume, they were losing compatibility. Lighter crude from the US or Middle East couldn't replace Venezuelan barrels without expensive modifications and efficiency losses. Washington initially assumed China would absorb the hit or concede. Instead, refiners reacted pragmatically, scouring global markets for crude with similar chemical profiles. Price mattered less than functionality. The goal was to keep units running at scale. Rather than forcing compliance, the pressure accelerated diversification and pointed China toward new heavy crude alternatives. Before we delve deeper, do us a favor and smash that like and subscribe button. This helps us reach more auto enthusiasts just like you. Now let's shift gears, because one supplier was perfectly positioned to step in. Canada steps in. Oil sands replace Venezuelan supply. Canada's oil sands crude shares critical traits with Venezuelan heavy blends. It's dense, sulfur-rich, and well-suited for complex refineries. For years, demand wasn't the problem, geography was. Lacking efficient access to Asia, most Canadian crude flowed south into US markets by default. That constraint changed with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. The new westward route gave Canada true export flexibility, opening direct access to Pacific ports. From British Columbia, shipments to Asia take roughly 17 days, faster and far more predictable than Venezuelan cargoes tangled in sanctions and rerouting risks. By early 2026, Chinese refiners weren't testing Canadian oil. They were contracting it. This wasn't speculation, but necessity. Canadian crude was legal, reliable, and politically stable. For automotive markets, consistency matters. Stable fuel supply underpins refinery output, pricing, and long-term vehicle investment decisions. But oil flows don't shift alone. They pull entire trade systems with them. Trade routes shift, Canada quietly redraws the map. Energy flows rarely move alone. They reshape trade, manufacturing, and industrial alliances. As Canadian oil shipments increasingly headed to Asia, broader trade data began echoing the same shift. Exports to the United States, long Canada's primary market, dropped to their lowest share outside pandemic disruptions. This wasn't demand collapse, but intentional redirection. Canadian exporters started looking east and west, rather than relying almost exclusively on the US. Gold shipments surged to the United Kingdom, while technology imports from Europe climbed. Energy exports to the US declined not from oversupply, but because alternative buyers stepped in. This signals a structural adjustment, not a temporary fluctuation. For automakers, the stakes are high. Vehicles depend on global steel, aluminum, electronics, and energy flows. Diversified trade routes boost resilience, but reduce political leverage. And this is where tariff policy collides directly with auto manufacturing reality. Tariffs backfire. Automakers hit the limits of pressure. Tariffs were intended to force alignment, but instead they reshaped incentives. US levies on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and lumber pushed costs higher across North America's integrated supply chains. Even when exemptions applied, uncertainty alone was enough to disrupt long-term planning. Automakers don't commit billions based on political assurances. They invest in predictability. As tariff threats stretched into 2026, Canadian exporters began planning around US disruption rather than relying on US access. That shift matters. Once new logistics routes and supplier contracts are established, old dependencies rarely return unchanged. Meanwhile, US refiners struggled to absorb fluctuating Venezuelan supply under revised licensing rules. Heavy crude surges clogged mismatched infrastructure, exposing a flaw in the strategy. Redirecting oil doesn't automatically create usable demand. For consumers, the result is volatility. Fuel prices, vehicle costs, and transportation expenses all feel the impact. And taken together, these pressures point toward a much bigger structural shift. Energy meets engines. Autos enter a multipolar world. At its core, this isn't just an oil story, it's an automotive one. Internal combustion engines may face long-term electrification pressure, but oil still anchors shipping, manufacturing, mining, and even EV supply chains themselves. Diesel moves parts, petrochemicals shape interiors, energy reliability underwrites production. Canada's emergence as an Asian energy supplier, China's rapid adaptation, and the limits of unilateral pressure all point to a multipolar reality. Control no longer rests solely on choke points. It flows through infrastructure, crude chemistry, logistics efficiency, and long-term trust between buyers and suppliers. Once pipelines are built, shipping routes optimized, and refineries recalibrated, leverage fades. What was meant to isolate competitors instead accelerated diversification. And that brings us to the final takeaway. Verdict: when strategic pressure starts backfiring. This isn't a story of instant winners or losers, it's a story of permanence. Energy systems, once reconfigured, don't snap back. Pipelines keep flowing, refineries stay tuned, trade routes harden into habit. What began as an effort to reassert control over oil markets ultimately revealed the limits of economic coercion in a world built on deeply interconnected supply chains. Canada gained autonomy. China gained options. The United States inherited volatility. For the automotive industry, the lesson is unmistakable. Fuel security, manufacturing stability, and vehicle affordability now depend less on political pressure and more on diversification and resilience. Markets adapt faster than policy, and once alternatives exist, dependence is never quite the same again. Now, it's your turn. Do tariffs still work in a world with flexible supply chains? Should automakers plan beyond North America faster than they already are? And does energy security matter more than electrification timelines? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe to Piston Pundit for more vehicle insights and industry shifts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next pit stop. You can now check out any of the videos on the screen. There's plenty more to explore.